Have you seen those dogs on social media that push buttons to communicate? Well, if you haven't, you can get recordable buttons for your dogs and record things like play, food, mom, outside. And then you teach your dog to press the buttons that correspond with what they want. And some people even teach their dogs really deep concepts and have buttons like why and because and feelings. And it's really awesome. And over time, a lot of these dogs learn to string together words and communicate like entire sentences and really surprisingly complex thoughts. And when you're teaching them this, it seems like at first they're getting it. And then all of a sudden, they look at you like they've never seen these buttons before. Then the next day, you're thinking to yourself, maybe they do understand. And then one day, they say something so clear and unmistakable that it's shocking. Like when we brought home a puppy, my older dog had been working with the buttons and he started pushing buttons for the puppy. The puppy was in an exercise pen and she was crying and we couldn't figure out what she wanted. And my older dog started pushing buttons like outside, puppy, outside, potty. And it took us a minute to realize it, but the puppy had to go potty, and my older dog was actually translating for her. And I remember standing there thinking, like, is this really happening? Did my dog just translate for this puppy? And then there's days where he still stares at the buttons like he's never seen them before and has absolutely no idea why I'm standing there and pressing them. And it's really funny because that's really similar to the way emotional healing feels sometimes. One day you think you're making incredible progress, and then the next day you're reacting the same exact way you did 5 years ago. You think you've learned a lesson, and then you find yourself right back in that same situation, wondering if any of this work is actually working. But then something happens. Someone pushes a button that would have completely unraveled you a year ago, and this time you stay calm. Or maybe you set a boundary that you never would be able to set before. And maybe you realize, oh, maybe I have been growing all this time. Because healing doesn't happen in a straight line. We like to think that growth works like school. You learn a lesson, you retain the information, you build on it, and eventually you become an expert. And that's great if you're getting a math degree. But unfortunately, emotional healing doesn't work that way. And in this episode, we're going to explore all the ways that healing and growth isn't linear, even though we would really like it to be, and why old patterns seem to come back over and over again, and how to tell the difference between being stuck and actually growing. And I have a feeling that this conversation might completely change the way that you look at your healing journey. And before we dive in, please make sure that you're subscribed so that you can get notified each time I put out an episode. They come out every Monday morning so you can start your week off with love and healing. Welcome to Jotindi, Journey to the Inner Divine, a sacred space for healing energy, emotional release, and soulful transformation. If you're ready to live with joy, ease, and purpose, you're in the right place. Healing isn't linear. This is something that is said over and over again in spiritual spaces. In fact, they say it so much that it's usually met with an eye roll and a, yeah, I've heard that before. But have you ever stopped and asked yourself what that actually means? Healing isn't linear? Because for a long time, I thought I understood it. And then I realized I didn't. I think most of us expect healing to work in a certain way. We recognize a pattern that we want to change. We do the work, we get a little bit better, and then we get a little bit better. And then eventually we arrive at some magical destination called healed. But that is not usually what happens. Instead, you find yourself in a situation and think, seriously? Again? I thought I already worked through this. I thought I healed this. Like, this is done by now. And I know I've had those moments. For a long time, I was repeating the same relationship patterns over and over again. And it felt like the same lesson kept showing up wearing a different outfit. And honestly, it was frustrating because I was doing the work. I was learning. I was growing. I was becoming more self aware. So why did I feel like I kept ending up in the same place over and over? But then when I took a closer look, something interesting was happening. I wasn't staying as long. I wasn't tolerating as much. I was speaking up sooner. I was leaving sooner. The pattern looked familiar, but I wasn't showing up as the same person. And that's when I started to understand what most people mean when they say healing isn't linear. Because healing doesn't usually move in a straight line, it moves in layers. You work through something, you learn about it, you process it, and then it fades into the background and it stops taking up so much space. And that lasts for months, years. And then one day something happens and there it is again. The same fear, the same insecurity, the same trigger. And your first thought is usually something like, oh, well, that's disappointing. Or maybe I didn't heal this after all. But that's not necessarily what's happening. A lot of the time, you're not back at the beginning. You're just meeting a deeper layer of this. You're seeing part of the pattern that you couldn't see before, or you're approaching it from a different angle. Or maybe you healed a piece of it and now another piece is ready to be addressed. And the issue that comes back isn't always the exact same issue. Sometimes it just shares the same roots. And one of the biggest mistakes that we make is assuming that because something feels familiar, that nothing's changed. We see the same type of conflict, the same trigger, the same fear, the same relationship dynamic. And we immediately start gathering evidence that we're failing, right? Why am I still struggling with this? Why do I keep ending up here? Why haven't I moved past this yet? But what if you're just asking the wrong question? What if the question isn't, why is this happening again? What if the question is, how am I showing up differently this time? Because that's where the growth usually hides. Growth doesn't always look like never getting triggered again. Sometimes it looks like recovering faster, or recognizing what's happening sooner, or asking for help instead of suffering in silence. And sometimes it looks like walking away after 3 months from something that you would have tolerated for 3 years. Those changes can be easy to miss because they're not dramatic and they don't feel like a big breakthrough moment. They're often the clearest evidence that healing is happening, though. And that same situation showing up doesn't mean that you're the same person facing it. And that's most important because if you don't recognize your progress, you'll spend your entire healing journey feeling like you're failing when you're actually growing. Now, before we go any further, I think we need to talk about something that gets confused all the time. There is a difference between repeating a pattern and revisiting a lesson. And those two things are not the same. Because if we're being honest, sometimes we really are repeating a pattern, right? Sometimes we do keep ignoring red flags. Sometimes we do abandon ourselves. And sometimes we keep making choices, the same choices, and hoping for a different outcome that time. And that does happen, right? But a lot of the time, that's not actually what's happening. A lot of the time, what looks like repetition is actually recognition. Think about it this way. Imagine a woman who spent 10 years in a toxic relationship and then she leaves. She does a bunch of healing work. She learns about boundaries and attachment styles, and she learns how to trust herself again. A few years later, she starts dating and she finds herself attracted to someone who displays some of the same unhealthy behaviors as her ex. Now, her immediate thought might be, seriously, again? Why do I keep attracting the same people? But let's look a little bit closer. Did she stay for 10 years? No. Did she ignore the red flags for years? No. Did she lose herself completely in this relationship? No. Maybe she noticed those warning signs after a few dates. Maybe she spoke up. Maybe she set a boundary. And maybe she walked away after a month. From her perspective, it feels like the same pattern. But is it really? Or is she just recognizing something that she couldn't see before? Because that's what growth often looks like. The lessons, they might come back around, and the opportunity to choose differently might come back around. Life has a funny way of giving us chances to practice the things that we've learned. And it's not because we're being punished or because we're failing. It's because awareness alone isn't transformation. Transformation happens when we respond differently. And sometimes the only way to know whether you've changed is when life gives you another opportunity to find out. And that's why familiar situations can be so frustrating. You think that they're proof that you're stuck, when sometimes they're actually proof of your growth. You just haven't learned how to measure that growth yet. And one of the reasons that this happens is because healing doesn't happen all at once. And oh Lord, I wish it did. I know we all do. I wish that we could just identify a wound, process it one time, and then never have to think about it again. Life would be so much easier if that was the case. But most emotional patterns aren't connected to a single experience. They're connected to beliefs, to memories, to habits, to protective mechanisms, ways that we've learned to survive. So when we start healing, we're usually not healing the entire thing all at once. We're healing the part that we are ready to see. Think about confidence, right? Someone might start working on confidence because they're afraid to speak up at work. Eventually, they might get comfortable sharing their ideas in meetings and think, awesome, I did it, healed my confidence issues. And then 6 months later, they struggle to ask for what they need in a relationship. And they're confused because they thought they already worked on confidence, but they're not dealing with the exact same thing. They're meeting a new layer of it. The lesson's similar and the root is connected, but the expression is different. And that's why healing can feel like a spiral sometimes. You come back around to these familiar themes again and again, right? Boundaries, trust, self worth, people pleasing, abandonment. And each time you return, you're standing in a different place than you were before. This time, you have more awareness, you have more experience, you have more tools, right? You're seeing something that you couldn't see the last time. And that's why I think healing is less like climbing a ladder and more like walking up a spiral staircase. Because when you're on a spiral staircase, you eventually pass that same view again. At first glance, it looks like you've gone in a circle. But if you look closely, you're actually higher up than you were before, right? You haven't returned to the same place. You've just returned to a familiar place from a new perspective. And I think that's where a lot of people get discouraged because they're measuring their progress by asking, is this problem gone? Instead of asking, how am I relating to this problem differently than before? I think most people measure healing by an absence of problems, but the healing is better measured by the quality of your response. So many people unconsciously define healing as when this never bothers me again or when I never get triggered again. But that's not a realistic standard for most of life. Even people with healthy relationships are still going to experience conflict. And even confident people still have self doubt from time to time. Emotionally healthy people still get hurt and disappointed and rejected and frustrated and afraid. And the absence of problems shouldn't really be our goal. The goal is a different relationship with those problems. Think about it think about grief, okay? A person can lose someone that they love and 20 years goes by. They still have moments where they really deeply miss them. And the fact that sadness still pops up doesn't mean that they haven't healed. But the question is, how much does it consume them? How long does it take to recover? Can they still experience joy alongside their sadness? That's healing. And the same thing applies to anxiety. The healed version of someone isn't necessarily a person who never feels anxious again. It's often someone who feels anxiety and doesn't immediately spiral, right? They recognize what's happening. They have tools. They know it will pass. They don't build an entire day or their entire identity around what they're feeling in that moment. And spiritual spaces sometimes unintentionally sell healing as a destination, as if one day you'll arrive at a place where you're completely untriggerable and perfectly peaceful and regulated and nothing ever bothers you again. But that's not being healed. That's being dead. Being human means that things are still going to affect you. The difference is that they don't affect you in the same way, right? If you used to spend 6 months devastated after a breakup and now it just takes 6 weeks to find your footing again, that's healing. If you used to stay in unhealthy relationships for years and now you leave after a few months, that's healing. You used to spend days criticizing yourself after making a mistake and now you're able to offer yourself some grace before the day is over, that is massive healing. And your problem may not be completely gone, but you're different. Your awareness is different. Your response is different. Your relationship with the experience is different. And sometimes that's a much better measure of healing than whether the problem ever shows up again. I mean, maybe healing isn't about becoming someone who never struggles. Maybe it's about becoming someone who knows how to move through the struggle with more wisdom and more self trust and a little more grace than before. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, okay, I get it. Maybe I've been measuring healing the wrong way, but that still doesn't explain why these things keep coming back. That's fair because there are certain themes that seem to follow us through life. For you, maybe it's people pleasing or a self-worth issue, or maybe it's abandonment fear or a tendency to put everybody else's needs before your own. And whatever it is, you've probably had the experience of thinking, haven't we already talked about this? Or maybe you've had a breakthrough. Maybe you learned something important. Maybe you think that you finally moved past it. And then 6 months later, or 2 years later, life hands you another opportunity to work with that exact same theme. At least that's what it feels like. But I don't think we're actually revisiting the exact same lesson. I think we're revisiting the same root from a different angle. Because most of the struggles that we face aren't tied to a single memory or a single event. They're connected to our belief systems, the way that we see ourselves, the way that we protect ourselves, the way that we've survived up until now. And those things are deep, they have more than one layer. You don't peel an onion and discover that you reached the center, or pull one weed and magically the entire garden is clear. You have to cover one layer after another. And every time you do, you get a little more awareness, a little more freedom, a little more choice. And that's why healing feels like a spiral. You come back around to this familiar territory, and your view looks familiar, and the lesson sounds familiar, and your emotions may even feel familiar, but you're not standing where you were before. And I've noticed this in my own life. There are themes that have followed me for years, trust, self-worth, boundaries, speaking up for myself. Every time I think I've learned everything there is to learn about them, life seems to hand me another opportunity to practice it. And for a long time, I thought that meant I wasn't getting it. And now I'm seeing things from a deeper level. So, what do you do when that old wound resurfaces? What do you do when you find yourself feeling that same fear or that same insecurity or frustration? And your first instinct is to think, well, I guess none of this healing has worked. First of all, don't panic. Seriously, don't immediately assume that you've failed. Don't assume that you're back at square one. And don't assume that because something feels familiar, nothing has changed. Instead, I want you to get curious. Ask yourself questions. What's different this time? How am I responding differently? What am I noticing now that I couldn't see before? What tools do I have now that I didn't have the last time this came around? How long would this have affected me 5 years ago, 1 year ago, 6 months ago? Because, like I've been saying, growth isn't in the fact that the problem appeared, the growth is in how you move through it. Maybe this time you spoke up sooner, or you recovered faster. This time you asked for help, or you gave yourself compassion instead of criticism, or you recognized the pattern before it had a chance to take over your life. Those things matter. In fact, they matter more than whether the problem showed up in the first place. And that is what so many of us miss, right? We are looking for evidence that we're failing when we should be looking for evidence that we're growing. The universe might not be showing you the situation because you failed the lesson. It might be showing it to you because you're finally ready to demonstrate what you've learned, to show just how far you've come so that you can celebrate. How would you know that you've become more confident if life never gave you an opportunity to speak up? How would you know that you've developed healthier boundaries if nobody's ever crossed one? Right? How do you know that you've healed your tendency to people please if you're never asked to choose between keeping the peace and honoring yourself? You know, this brings me back to the story that I shared at the beginning about my dog learning to communicate with the buttons. There are still days when I look at him and wonder if he even knows what the buttons do, right? He stares at them and then walks away, acts like he's never seen them before in his life. And if I judged his progress based on that one moment, I'd probably assume he wasn't learning anything at all. But then something happens. He'll circle back and he'll communicate something so clear, so thoughtful, and so unexpected that I'm reminded exactly how much he has learned. And I think healing feels a lot like that. Sometimes we're so focused on the moments when we struggle that we miss all the evidence of how much we've grown. We focus on that trigger that came back or that fear that resurfaced, and we forget to notice how we're responding, how much more aware we are, or how much more quickly we recover. And that the same problem showing up doesn't mean that you're the same person facing it. And if there's one thing that I hope you take away from this episode, it's that healing isn't measured by the absence of problems, it's measured by your relationship with them. So the next time an old wound opens up, instead of asking, "Why am I here again?" try asking, "Who am I now compared to where I stood last time?" You might be really surprised by the answer. And if you're ready to shift your perspective and to take this work deeper, then I have something for you. I have created an in depth resource full of reflective journaling prompts and exercises that you can do to find the clarity on the questions that I've been asking in this episode, to reconnect with your inner wisdom, and to find your own unique path forward. You can get yours at the link in the show notes or head over to mariaaurora.com/freebie/clarity and download your free clarity map. And of course, I would be honored to speak with you one-on-one about these patterns that keep showing up in your life. You can click the link in the show notes or head to mariaaurora.com to schedule your free 30-minute call. And if you found anything in this episode helpful, please take a moment to leave a short review. It helps more than you know. All right, I'll see you next week. And don't forget, there is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path.